At the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949, the Communist Chinese had won. And the Nationalist Chinese, that is the party of the Kuomintang led by Chiang Kai-shek, they retreated to the island of Formosa. Now, why did they retreat to this island? Well, because it was a Chinese island, it was separated from the mainland, and it was easy to defend. And more importantly, see, it didn't have that many resources or anything that the Communist Chinese needed desperately. They could afford to let it slip through their fingers, as it were. And so the nationalists who lost the Civil War retreated to Taiwan and built up their country. And that's why we have two Chinas. We have the Communist China of the mainland, and we have Taiwan, which is center-right, or basically anti-communist, which is the important thing. The losers found refuge there, and then when the communists in China started persecuting people, as they did, as they always do, because the communists always persecute everyone who dissents, everyone who disagrees with them. Always. Well, those people who were persecuted by the Chinese communists left the mainland and went to Taiwan to join the nationalists there. And that brain drain, because the smart people, the people with initiative, with brains, with drive, they didn't want to stick around for the Chinese communists, right? They were persecuted by the Chinese communists. So they left to Taiwan, and Taiwan exploded. It was a rock before they arrived. I mean, really, nothing there. Just a few fishing villages and whatnot. And today, Taiwan is certainly not a global power. It's a small country, but it's a very respectable country. It does very well. The people live extremely well. In fact, they live better than on mainland China. And of course, on mainland China, they didn't suffer the yoke of communism. But that's another story, okay? I'm not here to talk about Chinese history. What I'm here to talk about is the fact that in the Civil War in China, there were winners and there were losers, like in every civil war. And in the United States, when people talk about a civil war, they always think about the US Civil War, which was unique in many regards. It was unique because it was, territorially a neat division between the North and the South, which is exceptionally rare in civil wars. In civil wars, usually it's an issue of regions that are on one side or the other, or cities that are on one side or the other, and sometimes it's block by block, okay? The US Civil War is not the way most civil wars go. I'm talking Civil War 1.0, the one in 1861 to 1865. Yeah, no, most civil wars are like the Spanish Civil War or like the Chinese Civil War. They're messy, they're ugly, and the loser is ultimately ejected from the nation and finds refuge somewhere else. Now, in the Spanish Civil War that ended in roughly 1936, 37, I forgot my history, but the Republicans, they spread out and went around the globe. And there were actually some Spanish Republicans in Chile, as a matter of fact, a lot more in Argentina and other countries in Latin America and whatnot, because of obviously cultural similarities, specifically the language, right? But in other countries, they've gone to a territory, like Taiwan, a breakaway territory that the losers of the Civil War were able to settle in, regroup, and build something. Now, why am I bringing this up? Well, because a lot of people have been talking about a second civil war in the United States, which I believe is going to happen. At this point, most certainly. Because the American communists who've taken over, and they have taken over, and I did a video about it, you can find it right here. Well, the American communists who have taken over, they're hell-bent for leather on suppressing anybody who dissents. I mean, persecuting anybody who is not woke. And a woke ideology is just warmed over communism. It's replaced the class differences with racial differences, but it's the exact same thing. And what's funny is that a lot of the moneyed classes, the oligarchs in the United States, they are foolish enough to think that they can control this woke ideology and get it to do their bidding. They're fools. See, in other countries where you've had communist takeovers, the oligarchs thought the same. They thought that they could somehow buy their way into control of these communists. You can't. You can't because they're rabid dogs, but that's not the point of this video. The point of this video is that if there's going to be a second civil war, more likely than not, the United States is going to, the people who are anti-woke, the anti-communist Americans who are fighting the American communist woke, they're going to lose. And they're going to lose, and it's an uncomfortable fact, but you have to look at the facts, look at the truth squarely, and you can't pretend otherwise. And let me explain why they're going to lose. I've said this before. You see, back in a couple of years ago, in 2018, 2017, something like that, there was this analyst on Zero Hedge, or he was quoted in Zero Hedge, who characterized the American government as a turnkey totalitarian state. Now, for those of you who don't know, a turnkey property, it's a term used in real estate. A turnkey property is a property that's ready to move into because it has everything. It's not like an empty house with no furnishings and whatnot. No, no, no. A turnkey property, typically like a beach house, for instance, or a ski chalet, right? It has everything. It has sofas, it has rugs, it has coffee tables, it has beds, it has beddings, it has pots and pans and dishes and cutlery. I mean, all you need is the key. You put the key in, turn the key, and you enter the property and you're good to go. You're ready to live your life. You don't have to go out and shop and buy stuff, okay? A turnkey totalitarian state, of course, is a state that has all of the elements necessary for totalitarianism. And that's what the United States is. And this was identified 2-3 years ago. And now the communists have taken it over. They turned the key, unlocked it, and now they're inside. And they have all of the mechanisms for totalitarianism. And because of this, this is going to inevitably lead to a civil war. I mean, anybody who thinks otherwise is fooling themselves. Because there are enough people in the United States who are going to resist this. And there are enough people in the United States who are not only going to resist it, but they have the means to do so. But the problem is that nobody who has ever fought against the U.S. federal government has ever won. And that's a fact. Look at Waco. Look at Ruby Ridge. Look at any kind of confrontation by any group. The United States government has the manpower, has the resources, the intelligence apparatus, FBI, CIA, NSA, DIA, all of these alphabet soup agencies that can bring enormous force to bear against anyone who opposes them. And now that the American communists have won, they have that power, and they're going to exercise it. Because one of the things that you have to give credit where credit is due is that leftist communists, they know what to do with power when they get it. Not like conservatives. Conservatives don't know what the hell to do with power. It's like a dog chasing a car and catches the car, and then the dog's like, what do I do? What do I do? Leftists don't have a problem with that. Oh, no. And leftists, woke leftists, communists, because that's what they are, they know the power of the American federal government. They're going to use it. And they're going to win. And so the issue becomes, where are the American nationalists going to retreat to? What is America's Taiwan? And the answer is surprisingly simple. Alaska. Alaska is America's Taiwan. And you wouldn't think so offhand. You'd think, Alaska's way out there in the middle of nowhere. That's the point. That's the point. See? Alaska is not part of the United States, it's not part of the 48 states. It's way off there in the northwest. The Alaskan Peninsula is, in a very weird way, a very easy piece of property to defend, or more to the point, it's a very hard piece of property to conquer, which is essentially the same thing. It has resources. It has people, a population that would be sympathetic to anti-communists. Geographically, as I said, it's isolated. It has resources. It has the population. And ultimately, as things play out, I think that is one of the first territories that's going to be part of the coalition against the communist woke. And it's going to be where the American nationalists, when there is a civil war and when they lose it, that's where they should be thinking of retreating to. Let me explain why. You see, look at the map. Geography is everything. And you look at a map of the Alaskan Peninsula and you realize certain truisms. First of all, it's exceptionally hard to get to it. I know Alaska fairly well because I actually got to it. I drove there, yeah, from Canada. I crossed the Rockies on the Yukon Highway and took the Alaska Highway into Alaska proper. Or did I take the Top of the World Highway? It doesn't matter. There are only two roads. The Top of the World Road, the Top of the World Highway, and the Alaska Highway that run east to west. And they eventually land in Fairbanks. And the point of both roads is that, see, they're not even like properly like level pavement, okay? They're kind of like packed dirt roads. They're easy to cut off. I mean, you put a minefield there and that's it. That road is closed and it goes through the mountains, okay? So it's relatively easy to cut off, easy to put spotters to make sure that nothing advances through it. And yeah, it's easy to cut off the Alaska Peninsula by land from the rest of the North American continent. On the other hand, see, there aren't that many deep water ports in Alaska because Alaska is essentially tundra, especially to the north of it, north of the Brooks Range. The Brooks Range is on the northern third of Alaska, runs roughly east-west, and it sort of like divides the north of Alaska from the rest of it. Now, the south of Alaska, south of the Brooks Range, right? Now, that is basically wilderness. It's easy to get lost in it. And sure, there's all kinds of technology that can spot, you know, people lost in the wilderness, you know, thermal radiation and satellites and crap like that. But you have to keep in mind that Alaska is huge. It's roughly a third the size of the continental United States, much larger than Texas. And so, yeah, sure, you could say that you have satellites and all kinds of sophisticated gear to find people in that wilderness. But the problem is that it's so much wilderness, it's going to take so much time. And on top of that, it's full of moose and bears and crap like that. So it's actually going to be incredibly difficult to find people in that wilderness, fighters in that wilderness. And then you look at it from a naval perspective. You have Cook Inlet, you know, that gets into Anchorage, right? And there are a few other ports along the southern and southwestern edges of the peninsula. Forget about Juneau and the islands there in the southeastern corner of Alaska. See, all of that, you have to get there by boat and leave by boat. There are no roads that get to Juneau. Juneau, you can just give it up. You don't really need it. There's nothing really there. It's very pretty for the tourists and whatnot. But in terms of any kind of, it's too small, too concentrated. That would have to be given up, Juneau, right? And all the islands of those fjords. But the Alaska Peninsula itself, well, see, it's hard to disembark troops there. This is important. It's hard to disembark troops there because there aren't that many deep water ports, number one. And number two, you see, 1 or 2 submarines would be able to patrol that southern coast and torpedo any troop transport trying to get there. It would be a relatively simple task. It would not be difficult to defend the southern Alaska coast from an amphibious assault or an invasion of some kind. In fact, it would be bloody murder for them. It wouldn't be worth it. Because even if they managed to land on Anchorage and capture Anchorage, what then? Any kind of insurgent in Alaska would just retreat back north, retreat potentially all the way to the Brooks Range and give up the south of Alaska. And so what? There's nothing there. It's just wilderness. It's just moose and bears and nothing else. See? That's the beauty of it. It's a wasteland. And so an invading army trying to capture Alaska would be spending a lot of men and material and effort to capture nothing, to capture a wasteland. See? And that's why anybody with any kind of practical military experience would realize that invading Alaska is stupid. There's nothing to be won. Assuming that they would be interested in putting the manpower to invade Alaska, because Alaska is so big that in order to really hold on to it, you need at least 100,000 troops. And it sounds kind of crazy, right? But yeah, if you really wanted to capture Alaska and lock down any kind of insurgent that might have retreated to Alaska, you would need at least 100,000 troops, if not more. Remember, Alaska is huge, okay? I mean, that's the thing. You look at it on the map and it doesn't seem that big. But take Texas, double it. Now we're talking, okay? It's huge. It's bigger than the U.S. Eastern Seaboard from Maine to Washington, D.C. It's bigger than that. So in order to patrol an area of that size, you'd need so many troops, and they'd get bogged down in that wilderness. And that's why it's not that it's easy to defend, which is kind of is, but it's almost impossible to capture it and be able to lock down everybody and not have any kind of insurgency. And that's the point. Because the U.S. military has a lot of experience with insurgency, and they know that you can't really beat insurgents. You can't. They learned it in Vietnam, they learned it in Afghanistan, they learned it in Iraq, they're learning it in Syria, they're learning it in some African countries where they're deployed, right? Well-motivated insurgency, especially an insurgency that has nowhere else to go and has nothing to lose, is unbeatable. And the American military knows this, okay? So for the American military to go and invade Alaska where the American nationalists are holed up, it would be pointless. It would be foolish. The Chinese American, excuse me, the Communist American, not Chinese American, the Communist American Army would realize that there would be nothing to be gained and it would be an endless drain of resources. And more to the point, if they were able to mount an offensive to Alaska, to capture Alaska after a prolonged civil war in the contiguous 48 states, right? Assuming that they were able to do so. See, they would have to mass so many troops to go to Alaska and capture it that they'd leave their flank open on the mainland. Those insurgents could sneak over Canada, the Rocky Mountains in Canada, down to the Canadian border. The Canadian border and between the U.S. and Canada is just a line, okay? You can cross it practically anywhere. It's flat, okay? I mean, there aren't any mountains except in the Rocky Mountains to the west, but you know, in around Winnipeg and the Great Plains, it's easy to cross the border and no one's the wiser, and you'd have these insurgents who could be carrying out all kinds of attacks on the continental United States while you're off in Anchorage trying to capture a wasteland of wilderness, right? So the Communist American Army would realize that it's not worth it to go to Alaska. And if they tried, it would be so painful that in the end they'd retreat and leave Alaska alone. And Alaska, long term, is a fantastic place. A fantastic place for American nationalists. See? Because it has several things going for it. Okay? Number one, as I explained, it's easy to defend because it's so hard to conquer. Okay? It's like Russia. Russia is endless. Trying to conquer Russia is trying to grab fistfuls of sand. It's pointless. Number one. Number two, Alaska has oil, a lot of it. And see, of course, the American communists would want to grab onto Alaska and hold on to the oil there, yeah? Sure, the oil in Prudhoe Bay, that's extracted around Prudhoe Bay. But the problem is the Trans-America Pipeline. The Trans-America Pipeline, which I've seen, I drove right through it, right? Because you cross it when you're taking the Dalton Highway up to Prudhoe Bay, to the town of Deadhorse there, which I've been to. You see, the Trans-America Pipeline, it's 800 miles long, and a little over half of it is above ground. It's so easy to blow it up. I'm actually surprised that jihadis or whoever have not blown it up at this point. You know, some sort of terrorist incidents up to this point. Perhaps it's just too damn cold for the jihadis and they're figuring like, hell with it. We'll try to blow up some more buildings or something. Anyway, the point, and this is a serious point. See, if the American Communist Army were able to somehow hold on to Alaska, what they'd want to hold on to is Anchorage and Fairbanks and the Trans-America Pipeline, all the way from Prudhoe Bay all the way south to Anchorage, right? They'd want that desperately. And they try to hold on to it, but since I believe it's 420 miles above ground, 420 miles, you'd need, just a ballpark, say you'd need, a squad of soldiers every mile to hold on to it, and make sure that nothing happens, and you'd have to rotate those soldiers I mean, forget about any kind of electronic measures. See, if you have electronic measures, by the time you get the warning, it would be too late. The terrorists would have blown up the pipeline already. So you need soldiers right there on the ground, watching their mile of pipeline. 420 miles of pipeline. Do you have any idea how many soldiers that would be? I mean, just off the top of my head, you know, with regular rotations, you'd need a division just to make sure that you don't lose the pipeline, okay? And that's like in constant rotation, huh? All those troops pinned down over a stupid pipeline. Yeah, and of course, if they're pinned down because of that pipeline, they're easy pickings. Easy pickings for snipers, for booby traps. Hell, you'd have casualties up the wazoo. After the first day. I mean, I would guess that after a month of heavy insurgent activity, targeting that division, you know, protecting the pipeline, you'd have maybe at least 15% killed, and double that wounded and incapacitated. So basically, you'd have, you know, 45% attrition of your division after a month. So it's pointless to hold on to the pipeline if you're the American Communist Army trying to hold on to something of value in Alaska. But of course, if you're the nationalists who've finally been able to beat off the American Communist Army and have been able to establish a semblance of a republic in Alaska, then the pipeline, all that oil, brings in the revenue. It brings in the revenue where you can not only pay the people, right, but you can pay for food, see? You can pay for food and you can pay for necessities. And it's actually pretty easy to get all that stuff, insane as it may sound, because of good old global warming. Yeah, you can get it from Russia. Yeah, think about it. It's just on the other side, the other side of the Arctic Ocean. I've been to the Arctic Ocean. I took a picture there. It was a very boring picture. It was like me and the background, it was just all ice. Yeah, that was the Arctic Ocean, boring as all get out. But anyway, the point, and the serious point, you see, icebreakers and shipping can get through the Arctic Ocean during the summer months at least. Perhaps there are some periods in the winter when it's simply impossible, but during the summer months it is most definitely possible, certainly by air. And so because of it, trade could continue very quickly from Alaska with the northern European countries. Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Russia. And in short order, the Republic of Alaska could become a going concern because it has money, it'll have people, and most important of all, it's the kind of people that they would have. The kind of people you'd have in Alaska are motivated people. Think of it. You are part of a nationalist American army that lost the Civil War, right? You've retreated to Alaska. And you've finally been able to establish some sort of enclave in Alaska. So what's your number one priority? Making this a going concern. See, the Civil War will have killed off the weaker, the unluckier, the more vacillating. The people who would wind up in Alaska are the diehards. The diehards and the people who know better. Because more likely than not, in this kind of civil war, the communists, the American Communist Army and their representatives in the different branches, they would commit all kinds of atrocities that would, you know, just make people's hair stand on end. And so anybody who wound up in Alaska after losing a civil war, they'd be highly motivated. They would be exhausted, certainly, and a lot of them would, let's face facts, there'd be a lot of attrition of the survivors, of the losers, of the vanquished, because they'd just be exhausted. And say just to be on the conservative side, say 15% of the population goes because of depression, suicide. There'd be a lot of suicides. People on the losing side of civil war have a much, much higher rate of suicides than any other, of course. Yeah, you'd lose a lot of people. But the people who'd remain would be really, really tough, really diehard. And they would be motivated because they would know that there is nothing and no one to save them. and they would have experienced such misery to finally get to Alaska that they put every last ounce of their energy into making it a going concern. Paradoxically, the suffering and misery that they would have gone through to get to Alaska would become the fuel to supercharge an Alaskan republic. And that's not even talking about the people who actually live in Alaska right now. When I was in Alaska, something that really struck me was that a lot of them were liberals. I mean, like real commies sounding, right? They were all liberals, but they all had a gun. Yeah. They all had a gun, and they were all very pragmatic. Even the most lefty of them all, the biggest vegan, hippie dippy, flower girl, sandal wearing hippie, yeah? They were very pragmatic. Why? Because Alaska is a very, very difficult place in which to live. The beautiful country that it is, well, that nature is actively trying to kill people. Hell, when I stayed in Fairbanks, one night, this bear tried to eat my dog. Yeah, I was driving through Alaska. I spent about 2 months there. 2.5 months roughly. And I drove all over the state. I mean, from Deadhorse to Anchorage, the whole thing. And one night in Fairbanks, this bear was trying to eat my dog because the dog was sleeping in the Land Rover, right? And the bear just came up to the Land Rover and started scratching at it and trying to get at my dog, Claire, to eat her, and my poor dog was shitting bricks. The police came and they scared it off. Eventually, unfortunately, they had to put down that poor bear because the bear had grown used to people and wasn't really afraid of people anymore. And because of that, they had to put the bear down, which is a shame, but the point. See, people carry weapons in Alaska because nature is trying to kill them. The bears, the moose, and whatnot, okay? I mean, they all look really great when you see the moose in a postcard or whatever. You see a moose up close and personal, and that moose is not a nice guy. It's an animal that doesn't like you and probably wants to trample you just for the hell of it. And the bear wants to eat you, and it's a hard life. And so because of it, they're extremely pragmatic, and more likely than not, Alaskans would be the first group of people who would side with the nationalists in the Civil War, in Civil War 2.0. Not because they're not lefty, right? No, because they're pragmatic. And they would recognize that the American communists are crazy, because they are. They're crazy, and they are the product of decadence and degeneracy, and it's not really important in this video what they are or why they originated. The point. The people in Alaska would be sympathetic to the American nationalists and antipathetic to the American communists who've taken over. I mean, they'd recognize that they're crazy and they would want nothing to do with it. They would be welcoming to people who are fighting the communists. And more to the point, a lot of the nationalists, American nationalists, would be the self-sufficient type, the kind who can get up on their own and get through without the help of anyone. And that kind of mentality would be very much appreciated by other Alaskans. And so although there would be a huge influx of people from the mainland who would try to get to Alaska as their final refuge from the communist takeover, from the true communist takeover, from the beginning of the dictatorship of the woke, which is coming. Don't fool yourself, it's coming. Well, once these refugees establish themselves in Alaska, and they fend for themselves because they realize that you gotta fend for yourself and you gotta make your own way. Well, I think that the native population of Alaska and this huge influx of refugees would get along very well. And also, remember, they're all American, culturally speaking, okay? And they would all realize what's going on. And so they would all band together, which is a natural state of affairs for Alaskans. Because Alaskans, I mean, I have to admit, salt of the earth people, right? I was there, and it was many years ago, of course, but the fact remains, and I don't think it's changed very much, people in Alaska are exceedingly helpful to one another because they recognize how difficult life is in Alaska, and they recognize that everybody has to help each other if they are to survive. And that kind of mentality, that kind of mutual assistance, irrespective of any kind of politics or anything of the sort, that would lead to an incredibly cohesive society in Alaska. And this would matter for the long run. This would be exceptionally important for the long run, because in the long run, what would happen is that all of these refugees and Alaskans, all living up there in the wilderness, they'd not only get along, but they'd realize that they all have to row together in order to defend themselves from the American communists who would potentially be doing all kinds of measures to destabilize and destroy their society, number one. And number two, get out and get ahead insofar as trade, manufacturing, growing their society in a productive way, and hopefully making sure not to make the same mistakes that led to the American communist takeover. Why am I throwing this out there? Why am I talking about America's Taiwan? Well, because you could say that this is just a thought experiment, and it is. I mean, nothing even remotely close has happened yet that would necessitate some sort of plan B. And it could be also that there is a Civil War 2.0 and the nationalists win. They kick the ass of the woke commies, and it's just written off as a bad dream, And the years 2020 to 2032, which I think is how long the Civil War is going to last, they'd be written off like like a bad dream, like whatever. It doesn't matter. It would be written off historically speaking. But that's assuming that the wokesters lose. If they win, they are going to persecute people. And people now are talking about like the purge on Twitter. Oh God, grow up. Yeah, you get your little social media account shut down, right? And you think that that's a real purge? Ask the people in the Soviet Union. During the 1930s, a third of the population of Leningrad was sent to the camps, to the work camps. Okay, the work camps, the Gulag. Okay, a third of the whole city. It's the second major city in Russia, okay? Moscow and Leningrad. In Moscow, it was something like 20%, only 20%. That's real persecution. And that's the kind of persecution that's coming in the United States. And you don't believe me. And I understand, it sounds insane. But it's only recently that I've realized what this really is. I always thought that these wokesters were just idiots. I always thought that they were just fools. They're not fools. They're communists. They are communists. That's what they've always been. And they really succeeded in their long march through the institutions. They captured the educational system and they brainwashed multiple generations of students. Not all of the students, not even a majority at first. It was just a significant minority. And that minority grew and grew like a cancer. And now you have these wokesters, people like Jack Dorsey. I mean, can anybody claim that he's not a wokester? Of course he is. He's a wokester, he's a totalitarian. He's a liar and a psychopath. That's what he is. And you have other people, other examples of this. Zuckerberg, Sergey Brin, Larry Page, they're all on the same page. They're all wokester psychopaths. They're all communists. That's what it is. The politics of resentment apply to politics, to what you call it, to real world politics. That's what's going on. And there is going to be a civil war. I didn't believe it 2 years ago. I thought that was insane. But here we are. So I'm telling you, yeah, you think that there's been like repression as of late? You wait. And I'm telling you, Alaska is where you want to be. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please check out my Patreon channel. Link is in the description below. You'll find over 160, goddamn, 160 videos there that you'll find nowhere else. It's pretty cool. I do an extra video every week and a Sunday live stream called the Weekly Webinar, which is a call-in show. So do check it out. I hope you enjoy it. All the best, and catch you next time.